All right, we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Swarns. I'm a journalism professor here at NYU and the chair of our department's diversity committee, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this live conversation about the battle over race and belonging in America's schools. This program is part of our Big Read, Big Listen program, which brings all of our students together around one critical text, podcast, video, or documentary that deals with an issue of critical importance to journalists today. This time around, we've been listening to Southlake, a powerful podcast that explores a heated battle in a suburban town in Texas. This podcast has won a ton of awards, made me look so good for having selected it. It won a Peabody and was a finalist for the Pulitzer. And when you listen, you'll understand why. It goes deep and it's pretty raw. It focuses on a school district ruled by racist incidents, describes the efforts by a group of parents and students to promote a more inclusive curriculum, and the backlash that came afterwards from conservative parents and students. What happened at Southlake had a major impact. The playbook and the strategies used to derail the efforts to expand diversity and inclusion in local schools have been embraced by conservative activists around the country. This podcast was co-hosted by our guests here tonight, Antonia Hilton, an award-winning correspondent at NBC News, and Mike Hixenbaugh, an award-winning senior investigative reporter at NBC News. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us. We're excited.
Yes, thanks for having us.
So Mike and Antonia will talk about their work for a bit, and then we will open up for questions. So please post the questions in the Q&A. You'll see the chat isn't even available. So please post the questions in the Q&A, even as the discussion is going on, so that we will have them ready. All right, let's get started. Mike, I wanted to start with you. How did you stumble across this idea to start with? It sounds like it started with a phone call.
Yeah, well, first of all, again, thank you so much for putting this together. Back in the summer of 2020, in the lead up to the presidential election, in the middle of the worst stage of the pandemic, and in the aftermath of the protests for racial justice across the country after George Floyd's murder, I was seeing in my Houston suburb just this incredible level of animosity between neighbors. Like, look in the signs that were posted in their front yards and on my community Facebook page. And so I realized, that what we were experiencing, my wife and I, this kind of incredible tension over politics and racism in suburbs that were growing more diverse, was probably not just something in my neighborhood, but maybe a defining feature of 2020 in American life. And so I set out to write a story about that, not thinking about schools at all, really. And in the course of reporting on that, I had a phone call with the Texas GOP chairman, Alan West. I was asking him about this idea that Trump was going around saying that Black Lives Matter and Antifa and Democrats wanted to destroy the suburbs, getting his take on that. And in the course of that, he mentioned, well, I'll give you an example. This well-to-do, affluent community in North Texas, Southlake, where he described that there was an attempt by Black Lives Matter to take over the schools, and that these conservative parents had banded together and beat it back. And I just took a note, like, follow up on that. And I did, and I teamed up with Antonia after the election, and we ended up doing some reporting there that showed exactly what you described in your intro, that there was an attempt to make the school more welcoming, this wealthy, mostly white, but diversifying town, after a racist incident with a viral N-word video made by students. And that in their plan to address that was launched into this time in 2020, when there was this building blowback to those efforts. And Antonia can talk about this, but we wrote our initial stories. She made a piece for NBC Nightly News, and we really thought that was the end of it. Maybe we could follow up, but Afterward, our inbox is filled up with messages from all over the country, from people in Missouri and in Pennsylvania and in Florida who are saying, oh, Southlake is the same thing that's happening in Southlake is happening in my suburb.
Right.
And that's really what led us down the path of making the podcast.
Antonia, I wanted to ask you, your I love your Twitter handle describes you as a correspondent who covers America's fight over race, history, and memory. And I was wondering, what appealed to you about this story, and what did you want to explore more deeply after the show aired on the nightly news? What did you want to explore for your viewers?
Well, thank you for calling that out. I should make clear that's a title or a description of my job that I've given myself, and not my official title at NBC
and a
News.
good one. But it's a good
I cover politics and civil rights at NBC News, but I ended up describing it that way because I realized that was becoming part of sort of the central political discussion, and that if you weren't going to, as a journalist, engage particularly with history as you were covering this moment, you weren't going to be getting the story right. And that's not just if you were doing education reporting like we were. I think that applies to, frankly, sort of any realm of politics, disinformation reporting, a lot of what NBC News is focused on right now. So thank you for calling that out. But that's sort of how I ended up really shaping my own job and career here. As Mike mentioned, we received hundreds of emails and messages, DMs on Instagram. People were reaching out to us in whatever way that they could. I wish that I could say that Mike and I, when we did those first stories, knew where all of this was going in that moment. But the truth was, we were kind of discovering and uncovering all of this as we went along. And so those messages that we received were the first, I guess, sign or hint to us that something bigger was coming, or that what we had seen, grow and culminate into this very well-organized political movement in Southlake was actually spreading to other school districts. And we thought, okay, well, we need to do a little bit more. And what might that look like? We did more, digital reporting. We did more, I did more packages for nightly news and MSNBC and other shows. But a podcast ended up being the right place to explore this, I think, because it really required long form. It required investigative and enterprise resources. And what we really wanted to do was kind of connect historically this moment to, frankly, what some of Mike and I had actually experienced as students and as young people growing up in other parts of the United States. And, what I always found really interesting about this story was that it was new and old at the same time. A lot of the tactics, the amount of money being spent in school board races, for example, how partisan these races have become, that can feel really new. Trumpism in itself can feel very new. And yet, when I look back, or I would talk to my parents while I was doing some of these reporting, fights over diversity, race, and the politicization of how we teach history or what programs we're going to lead in different public schools, that has been going on in the United States forever. And the podcast gave us an opportunity to kind of look into the history of Southlake, its formation, those early years, these first families of color that moved there, and connect their experiences and decades of microaggressions or overtly racist incidents that had occurred into the town to the moment that boiled up. Because, while it initially seemed to be a story about the midterms happening at that time, about a certain group of political actors, the truth was the story in Southlake had actually been decades in the making. The story in every town where all of these conflicts have been transpiring has been decades in the making. So I guess, in short, my answer to you would be that I saw this opportunity to do what I really love doing as a journalist, which is to connect the past and the present, to give people, families, a space to talk in depth and safely about topics and experiences that don't often get a ton of time. I saw an opportunity to shift the way that we were covering this issue. People were having panels on cable news and going back and forth about the definition of critical race theory, for example. But kids' voices were not at the forefront. What was actually happening in school wasn't at the forefront. People didn't really have a lot of evidence for what they were claiming they said teachers did, what they were claiming teachers or administrators had taught. Mike and I had an opportunity to actually go into a school, have audio, experiences, evidence of what actually transpired. Why was a diversity program proposed in the first place? What actually happens between kids in school systems, majority white school systems where the demographics are shifting? What are kids of color or LGBTQ kids experiencing in those systems? We were able to get that. And I think one of the reasons the podcast ended up resonating with people is because it ended up being stuff that frankly many of them had never heard before, or for many of the people of color,
or they had
they had heard, but they had never seen reflected back to them accurately in reporting. And so that for me was the most gratifying part of it. And as I've talked about at times during the series or in other talks that Mike and I have done, I went to a school not that unlike Southlake, a public school, majority white, at the time starting to diversify. My family was one of the first Black families in the school system. And talking to some of these kids in Southlake was actually even cathartic for me. So, I then found that I think so many people were connecting with us, and it gave us this opportunity to, I think, tell a really complicated personal and political story, but in a format where we could really explore in the length and the time that it deserved. And thank you for the kind words also that you said about the series, because Mike and I put a lot of heart and soul into it. And so we're so glad that it resonated.
I could tell. So going into this, you knew obviously, because it was, this is a really fraught topic, one that was roiling at the time that you were deciding to go deep into this community school boards around the country. And just the issues of race and diversity being so difficult for so many people right now. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what kinds of challenges, if any, you anticipated in trying to go deeper and to hear from both the families that were really trying to change the curriculum to reflect the changing community, and the families that were trying to say absolutely not, that is not our community and we don't have a problem. I'm just wondering, going into that and knowing very well from the reporting that you had already done, how did you think about the challenges that you would encounter? And Mike, maybe you can.
Yeah, I'll dive in. After we published our initial stories, and while reporting the initial written article and the TV piece, we got a preview of how this was going to go. I think, for that initial article, I think I reached out to 12 or 12 or 15 parents who'd spoken at board meetings passionately against the diversity plan, and also had reached out to the town's mayor, who had come out against it, and a candidate for mayor, a member of the city council, who'd come out against it. And nobody for that initial article was willing to speak with me. And in fact, in the aftermath of that, the city council member who was running for mayor made a false statement on social media, claiming that I had shown my bias in my initial messages to him and that I had a pre-written narrative, which was untrue. I received a lot of nasty messages from people who thought I, hadn't reflected their side of the story, even though I'd reached out to so many people and quoted their words from their public comments at board meetings. And so heading into the podcast, we made it our mission to hear from folks who had that perspective. I mean, we came into it when we were working on this series. People talked about, like, I think there was a PBS documentary years ago called Two Towns of Jasper that was like reflecting race relations, and it went into the homes of white families, and they went into the homes of Black families, and they kind of got drilled down deep. And I think that's what we wanted to do. Like, we wanted to hear, not to both sides this story or to create a false equivalence, but we wanted to understand what these families and parents and political activists really were feeling and thinking, and what made them so worried about sending their white kids off to these schools. I think we contacted 50 people between
50.
me and Antonia
Wow.
and our documentary team colleagues who were working on a separate but related project.
Right.
And in the course of that, actually Antonia had our only success. She was able to get some parents early on to talk outside of a board meeting. But that for her initial nightly piece really is what that was for. For the podcast, we really weren't able to go inside people's living rooms like we wanted to, because we're living in an era now where NBC News is framed by people who have conservative political beliefs. NBC News is not to be trusted. Mainstream media is not to be trusted. And what I've really found when I drill down and actually have had conversations with some of these folks off the record, what is your critique? What is your criticism of reporting? And my conclusion has been, unfortunately, at this point, there's a lot of people who believe objectivity in journalism means not quoting people I disagree with. What they really want is for us to come out in support of their position and not quote the Black mom whose kids came through the school district and felt traumatized. They were mad that I gave her voice and that I quoted her at all, because they thought that her comments were wrong and they disagreed with them. And so, but I will say this real quick. When you listen to this podcast, I don't think anyone can argue that you do not come away with a complete understanding of these parents' perspectives, because they did a lot of talking at public school board meetings, and we played their comments. We dedicated huge sections of this series to their voices and to making sure that those voices were captured so you could hear in their words why they think it's wrong to teach kids about microaggressions, or why they think white privilege is reverse racism, or why they think that all education should be colorblind. We played their words.
Right. Right.
And then, what comes back at us is an allegation that we've painted the town as racist, or that we've made this broad, but you can't find that in the series. We never say that. They may have drawn that conclusion after listening to their own words played back to them, but it's not something that we said.
Right. Right. And so from the start of the reporting on the podcast until it aired, none of the families that were opposed to the diversity plan agreed to speak to you. No. And Antonia, talk a little bit about the families that you spoke to for your NBC Nightly News segment.
Outside of the school board meeting. So
Yeah.
some of the conservative families.
Yeah.
So I spoke to some conservative parents outside of a school board meeting one night. And what was interesting is that they came to me, and the beginning of our conversation was actually them saying that they were so angry at Mike because he hadn't quoted any of them. And I said, one of you,
Right.
I actually happen to know, Mike reached out to you and
Right.
to interview you, and you said no. And he was
Right.
like, well, he could have, there's other people he could have contacted. And so, I had just
Right.
had a really frank conversation first with them. Mike reached out to many of you, made it really easy for you to get in touch, offered for you to pass contact on to other people, who you could have recommended if you didn't want to speak, represented people's comments as they were in the stated in public board meetings. And I agree with Mike that the sense that I got was that they felt that some of the families we did speak to just didn't deserve to actually represent their town at all. They didn't want them quoted at all. And they didn't see them as legitimate, members of the community. And, what I found I was able to have success that one evening outside the school board was first because I spent about 20 minutes of my time just kind of going back and forth with them, answering questions for them about how our reporting process worked. Telling them I flew here from New York and investing time to be here at the school board meeting, to listen to you, to talk to you, to get this story right. And so a couple of the parents were willing to speak with me. What, they said was much of what, you hear in the podcast, which was, that they believed that these kinds of programs would end up adversely affecting white students, that their kids would potentially lose out on opportunities if they misspoke or made missteps, that, you know, pointing out people's color and having rules that acknowledge differences in race, you know, it encourages racism and encourages people to see color and difference. And I spoke to one Latino father who, you know, really felt like, you know, because I've made it in America, you know, I came from a family of immigrants and I made it. And now my kids are in this great school system and I live in this wonderful town. You know, I alone am an example that none of this stuff can really be true. And I was able to have, you know, an interesting and honest back and forth with him where most of what I did was frankly just present to him what I knew about a lot of the other kids' experiences. What I thought was really interesting though is, and that I found was a theme throughout the podcast that Mike and I talk about a lot, was that the parents were often exchanging really vile words, attacking each other on Facebook, online, at school board meetings, at times even escalated to sort of nearly physical altercations at these board meetings. The kids, though, even the kids of conservative families, often had a lot calmer perspective on all of this. They were a lot less afraid of these conversations. They were a lot kinder to each other. That's not to say that they didn't harm each other. You know, we have there's 2 episodes, 2 and 5, devoted to a Black student in conflict with a white student who said the N-word, and then an episode of a queer student bullied by a number of male classmates. And so absolutely students harmed each other. But they were kind of more willing to have frank conversations about the source, the reality of those harms. And the adults seem to kind of want to live in a little bit of they seem to have versions of what their schools were like that, at least when you talk to the kids and even the teachers that we've spoken to, didn't reflect the reality of what was going on in those hallways. And so a lot of what I was trying to do was, I think, present those parents with the stories of what a lot of the kids were telling us and see sort of like, you know, like, essentially, are you saying that none of these experiences are valid? Is there nothing that should be done for those kids? And I think,
how did they respond? How did they respond? Talk a little bit about when you brought that, because it's very interesting. I think it seemed as if people were willing to say, okay, that one thing there, that shouldn't have happened. Okay, that one thing there, okay, that shouldn't have happened. But a program that deals with our district as a whole, step back. Is that kind of?
Yeah, I think you got it. That they would say, it's kind of the bad apple argument, right? Okay, so that's one kid who did that. Okay, well, those kids graduated. They said the N-word, but now this video was a couple of years ago. Why are we still talking about this? That came up a lot. Why are we still talking about this? And we would say, well, there are kids who say this is actually still going on. Kids who tell us they actually hear the N-word in the hallway of these schools every single week. Does that not alarm you? And it was really hard, frankly, to get certain parents to believe the experience of marginalized kids, to either think that they were telling the truth or that their experiences were pervasive enough that they warranted, you know, systemic action. That's actually a word they really don't like when you use the word systemic in any questioning to you. You know, to them, it represents a sort of view of the world, an approach to tackling racism, right? That you know, they're ideologically opposed to. And so a lot of it was just trying to ask them, like, in very basic and frank terms, you know, like what they happen to know is going on in the schools, what they've seen, what they would say to the kids who've gone up in front of them at these board meetings and presented their stories, and to see. And at the end of the day, a lot of them just didn't think any changes needed to be made at all. Mike, I don't know if you even feel it.
No, I was going to say that the one thing that the conservative group rallied around was, okay, there are isolated incidents of racism, just like there are anywhere in the country and everywhere in the country. And the solution is to better enforce the student code of conduct. They had determined, like, we don't need to change the student code of conduct. We don't need to train students or teachers on, you know, any of this, you know, work around cultural awareness or understanding history, or certainly nothing related to accepting LGBTQ students. And what really just needed to happen is that the administration needed to crack down and really enforce the student code of conduct to, you know, knock these cases down as they come up.
And I want to stop you there. I mean, one of the things, and we have obviously a number of journalism students here that I think was really, is really instructive in what you guys did here was on both sides of these issues that we've been talking about here now. One is, how do you get, in a practical way, the voices of people who don't want to talk to you, and you mind those community meeting videos and recordings to enormous effect, right? I mean, because it's really powerful. And I think that's something that, you know, we journalists think about, but students should think about too, that there are opportunities there. And then in terms of dealing with that question about the student code and using recordings from students, right? To show how that just fell down. And so I think, and of course, obviously you were dealing with an audio format, so recording is everything. But even for a print person, these were just, it was just really rich material that you were able to mine. And maybe you can talk about the student recordings, because they really were the students were the ones who were able to show the listeners, actually that solution that people are proposing isn't working.
Yeah, those recordings, the two that we're referring to, are, you know, that Antonia referenced, in which a Black student way back in 2018 had recorded her confrontation in the principal's office with a white student who was using the N-word and insisting that it wasn't, you know, a slur, or that anyone should be able to say it. And the emotion in her voice was, obviously, the second that I heard that, the second Antonia heard that, we were like, oh my God, like, you know, personally, I had never heard anything like that before. And it really, so that in that moment, the listener gets a sense of, you know, this is what's happening. And you can hear in the student's voice how this affected her. It's not just a word, as the voice said, like, this was affecting this girl in a visceral way. What are you going to do about it? And the second recording, again, was a queer student. After all of this had blown up in the school district, and they were debating this policy, and everyone, you know, on the conservative side were saying, we just need to enforce the student code of conduct. We don't need any training. And you walk into this, you know, as a listener, you walk into this meeting where the student's recording her principal, and he doesn't seem to understand at all the context or the meaning behind the anti-LGBTQ attacks on this student, where the boys were calling her gender identity a mental illness, and using vulgar words that we couldn't get past the NBC censors into the podcast for the most part. And you can just hear the principal saying, oh, they're just trying to debate. They're just trying to have a political debate. And in that moment, you can hear, all right, well, he has the student code of conduct. He says he's working to enforce it, but this man, this adult who's in charge of the well-being of these students, doesn't understand the LGBTQ experience at all. And makes the case, as this debate's happening, literally the election was coming up, and here's what's happening in the schools. While the adults are arguing in the schools, this child is being re-victimized in the principal's office, or in a Zoom call with her principal. She went to them to say, this isn't right, this happened to me. And she suffered more emotional trauma from that call than she did from the messages from the boys in her class. And so that we came into this project not knowing that audio existed. And it was, in both cases, you know, it's one of those moments when you're out reporting, you know, this is just a sad fact of journalism, where you stumble across something terrible, but at the same time, you know, like, this is really important. And it was really important to find for those recordings to surface, so that we could play them and let people hear with their own ears. And we really dedicated time in the podcast. Like, we just let the tape play, and you become kind of immersed in those moments.
Yeah, and I would like to remind our viewers that if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A, even as we're speaking, because Mike and Antonia will be able to answer your questions when we wrap up this part of our conversation. And then Tony, I guess I want to circle back to something you talked about earlier on. You know, a lot of our students are really interested in covering issues of race and social justice. But I think they often talk about kind of feeling intimidated about diving in, feeling intimidated about perhaps covering a community that they don't know. And you talked a little bit, just as we were starting this conversation, about just, you know, both of you and your own experiences, kind of your different backgrounds coming into this story, working together as a team. You've written about it too. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, what that was like for you, and how you approach this kind of story.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, first, I guess to the dynamic between me and Mike, I think that we were really, in some ways, a perfect team partner.
Can I ask, was this by Black and white co-hosts by design? We know newsrooms are wrestling with these issues too.
No, I think that it was both of us. He had that conversation with Alan West. He was getting ready to publish his digital piece. And I have reported on similar issues and done a lot of work at the intersection of sort of politics and education. And so my mentor, who is now, who's, EP'd and ran this whole series, she basically just said, she once called me and just said, I think you and Mike would be really good friends. And it wasn't, you guys are going to go make a podcast now, you guys should go make something. It was just, I think you two would be good friends. And I think you should talk to him about the story that he's working on, because it connects to stuff you're doing, and who knows what ideas will come of it. But it was really just I think you guys would get along kind of conversation. So that's actually how that came together. But it's interesting that you brought that up, because that was actually one challenge for me, frankly, as a Black reporter on this project, right? Is that there were times when people, I think, thought that my role in the series was to be like the Black translator. And I will say, for any young Black,
we've experienced that,
or Latino journalists or aspiring journalists on this call, that is a thing that you encounter a lot. That people think, they look at you, they assume, and they will question your credibility or your dedication to objectivity and the truth. And so there were some moments while making the series where I had to stomach some comments from people in the community, or even from other reporters at times, who knew that Mike and I were working on this. And I'd be lying if I said those things didn't hurt my feelings or affect me. But at the end of the day, I think if you're a journalist who wants to cover these issues, that's something you sort of have to emotionally prepare yourself as a reality of the job. And then I think you have to have a lot of trust and faith and kindness to yourself, that, and knowing that, like, the quality of your work and who you are and what you're going to be able to accomplish when you get into the field. And so, as Mike mentioned, the two pieces of audio he just talked about, we didn't have that pre-planned. We didn't know about those two stories actually when we launched this podcast. That was the result of
you didn't actually. Oh, so that's interesting. So I didn't understand that. I understood that you didn't have that when you started, but literally the episodes were going, and that audio came to you.
Well, the episodes weren't being published yet. But we had an outline for the series. We thought we knew what we were doing. Okay. And we came across these things, and we shifted. We always joke that we were building this car as we were driving it down the highway.
Right.
And so there wasn't really a lot of time for me to let myself get down or to doubt myself in this. We met Raven, we sat on her couch, we talked to her, and she just happened to mention to us, yeah, one time I recorded my principal while I was in a fight with this guy. We were like, what? And then she was like, yeah, no, this boy said the N-word when I was in class, and then I went to my principal's office and I recorded it. We were like, what? Oh, can we hear this? It's like these things just happen because we happen to go into town together. Mike and I have a lot of trust, which, can be a tough thing in this business. It can be competitive, it can be hard. You can be trained as a journalist to really just depend on yourself and to do things alone, to sort of find someone with whom you work really seamlessly. Huge gift. And so I think that what we were able to do as a series, we were able to do because we had each other. And yeah, I mean, I think too that our different life experiences made the series very strong. So as I mentioned, you know, one of a few Black families in a white town, in a school district very highly ranked in Massachusetts. Difference between that school district and Southlake is a lot of those families were liberal, but they were the kinds of liberals who often honestly didn't really interact with people of color very often, and said a lot of things or made remarks about me, often to my face, that I'm not even sure they knew at times were really hurtful. Me and my siblings were often really lonely in the school district. I'm one of 7, so we spent a lot of time being each other's friends, and hanging out with kids of color who my mom made a huge effort to connect us with in other towns. You know, this is something I'm saying that I know a lot of Black kids can nod along to, but I don't think white kids know that that's how lonely sometimes going through these school systems can be.
And you brought some
so,
of that actually into the piece, which I
yeah,
thought was really interesting, where you brought that experience to the listeners in dealing with an issue that I think might occur to people, right? Why would Black parents stay, right? Why would Black parents stay? And I thought it was very insightful, especially for people who haven't lived that experience, to understand what that kind of decision is like and about.
yeah. And you know, the thing
Yeah,
is, and
Mike.
Mike helped me understand, though, for kids, white kids who grew up in districts where, you know, they didn't learn Black history. They learned a very odd version of, you know, Thanksgiving, for example. You know,
Right.
I understood, I actually could come to understand, you know, for him, the ways in which going through school and actually knowing nothing about people of color and the real history of this country or this world actually hurts white people too. So it wasn't always just
Yeah.
about how I'd been hurt, right? You know, like Mike was robbed of something in his school as well. And so I
Yeah.
think that our ability to kind of talk about those things and have a lot of empathy for each other and all the people that we met, not just one group of people, not just one type of parent. I think that was sort of the special sauce, honestly, that made this possible. So I don't think it's so much of Black and white reporter able to do this story about Black people versus white people or something. I think it was honestly 2 people who were able to build a really good friendship and reporting process out together and tackle this really hard story, because our different life experiences helped us kind of look at it from all sides together and come up with something really good at the center.
And one of our early conversations in reporting this together, I felt compelled to acknowledge to Antonia that I, to a certain degree, was the white kid saying the ignorant comments at some point in my life. And because I grew up in a town in Ohio where everyone was white, virtually everyone was white. You know, there was, and for the one non-white biracial kid in our school, we had a racist nickname. You know, subtly racist, but you know, not great to identify someone by their skin color in their nickname, right?
Yeah.
And that's just, you know, something that I went off into the world, into a very multicultural, diverse world, going to a public university in Ohio, where I had to kind of stumble my own way through this and learn by taking classes and having honest conversations with people. And it's like, I realized as I was entering this reporting project that, you know, that's a piece of the story. I talked with Carroll graduates, Southlake graduates, white students who went off to college and had the same experience I did, because they had no opportunity to discuss these things with guidance and an educational lens on being inclusive, you know. And so they went off to college and touched and played with their Black roommate's hair and made comments about it because it was new and interesting to them, and they didn't realize that the history and the harm that they were doing in doing that. And you know, I'm not trying to justify any or make light of those things, but honestly, how was that kid supposed to know? To know that history if no one ever stopped them before and said, no, that's not okay. And so, yeah, I think in having those conversations with your colleague, and it wasn't like a confessional, but it was like, you need to know, like, this is my background, this is my experience and my bias, and it's a way of checking each other too. And that was great for writing the script. There were moments where I think that I or an editor had typed something into a script, and because we co-wrote these things, and sometimes I'm writing in Antonia's voice and she's writing in mine, and where Antonia said, no, I'm not saying that, but we're going to say this differently, because we're learning, but to have the freedom to do that, there's so much talk now, like, oh, like, we can't have conversations like this, you're going to get canceled, you can't have these bad opinions, or you can't have these conversations, it's too much of a landmine. And no, I think if you go into it earnestly and you respect each other, you can do projects like this that are delicate and learn actually from each other.
We are going to be opening up for questions soon, so please put those questions in the Q&A. Can you talk a little bit about the reaction that you received to the podcast, aside from the awards, which I knew were coming? What kind of reaction did you get from folks in Southlake and around the country?
There was a lot. At times it was, to put it simply, at times it was overwhelming. We received so many emails and messages and calls that we ended up setting up an email, an NBCU email, that's southlake@nbcuni.com, so that people could reach out to that email instead of me and Mike or anyone else they found out was attached to the series. Because people would, and this was on all sides, of course. I think you can imagine for people who were, angry again about some of the families that we highlighted, some of the stories that we told, they would write quite angry and sometimes hurtful stuff to me and Mike. Then other times we would receive, mile-long emails from someone opening up about an experience. The first ever Black cheerleader from Southlake's Carroll School System wrote me a really lovely note talking about how, that was such a formative and at times really traumatizing experience. And she never had really had a space or people to talk about it with. And that the podcast for her, even though it came decades later, these are kids she never met, she moved out of town, she doesn't really know them. She just had such a reaction to it. She just wanted to let me know. We started getting emails from people in other school districts, educators, teachers, administrators, people who were trying to do DEI work, almost reaching out to us, being like, you seem to know more about what's starting to happen in my district than I do. So, we're wondering. And so at times it was overwhelming. And that's very kind of you to say that you knew it was going to win all the awards, because
I knew.
There were times when Mike and I were very nervous about where all this would go, or we thought we had devoted a year and a half of our lives to something that maybe wouldn't touch that many people, or we didn't really know. And so, honestly, even the criticism, but that stuff didn't really hurt or bother or discourage me. With this, area of reporting, you're going to get response. You're going to get people who sometimes say hurtful, racist stuff to you. And I won't say that it never gets to me, but I will say I have developed an ability to see the bigger picture of what I try to work on, and to be really grateful for all the people who've earnestly engaged and sent questions and wanted to know more, and to really value that and the work that I've done and the relationships I built along the way over those things. And so, to now see that the podcast has had such an impact and has been recognized is really wonderful. But, the work is actually really, we still have more work to do. And Mike and I have a lot on this topic that I can't say too much about, but that we want to still accomplish. And so mostly it was really motivating. It told me we were onto something really important. I think it's something that, I don't know, Mike, if this sounds dramatic, but I think it changed both of our lives and our careers and what we both plan to do over the next several years. And so, you know, I think it was just as a journalist, one of those moments where you were like, wow, like I did a story that actually changed a community. You know, there's an ongoing federal investigation in Southlake. What may or may not happen in that district in the coming months or years, you know, we're going to be keeping an eye on. There are other districts, of course, in Texas and around the country now engaged in these the same or similar battles. And a lot of times we hear from people that Southlake helps them understand. It's like the beginning place where they go to really grasp this moment. And that's such a high compliment that we made something that helps people maybe better know what to do, more, I don't know, have more compassion in their daily lives, in their communities, to look at their neighbor in a slightly different way, to have an open mind. Those are the only things that you can ever ask for when you do this type of work. So I'm incredibly grateful for the reaction we've received, the good and the bad.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna save a question for you guys because I definitely want to hear your advice for students who are embarking on stories that deal with these issues. But first, this is a good one because it speaks to kind of how this kind of work might affect you. Blay Ying wants to know how you protect your mental health, knowing so many sad stories and specific details happening in schools and listening to this footage. Can you talk a little bit about what that is like, and how do you deal with? I have to say the queer student who isn't named, you were talking about that, Mike, and it was just heartbreaking. So I don't know if you can talk about kind of as reporters. She wants to know how do you protect yourselves and as you're doing this work.
Yeah, I mean, and this goes for a lot of reporting. I mean, I think that there's a growing awareness just broadly across society and in journalism that the work we do, whether we're directly affected by these stories or it's just secondhand trauma, that it affects us. And there's some great training programs out there from the DART Center that I recommend students take a look at. And NYU, I'm sure you can arrange some sessions where they just talk about one, how to approach people who've been through trauma and how to report on that with care, and also how to cope when you are experiencing the secondhand effects of hearing people's stories, or during the course of reporting Southlake, I was in Texas when when we had the freeze, and my home, I reported on that story alongside reporting on Southlake, but my home had pipes burst and I had a child rushed to the hospital that week. And that's trauma in my own life that's layered upon the fact that I've now been I've followed up by reporting on kids who died in that situation. And then on top of that, reporting on this project where, when I hear the tape from, we called her M in the podcast, the queer student who's, just crying, talking to her principal. I actually hear that tape and I'm a dad, so I've got 4 little kids, and I hear that tape and I think of my own kid in that situation. I'm filled with anger. And you can't, I think as a reporter, that's good to feel those things and to acknowledge that and not hide those emotions behind this false veneer of objectivity. Like, I can say I heard that audio and it made me upset. And I think acknowledging those things and finding time to walk away and look away from this work and finding outlets that aren't journalism, because I think a lot of journalists, especially early in your career, the work becomes your life. It's a problem when you get into a profession where your work is your passion and it's your identity. That alone is worth a lifetime of therapy to work through those things, and finding your self-worth in your work, but at the same time dealing with all this trauma. Honestly, like the answer is like, talk to a therapist, talk to people, talk to friends, see a therapist, and find hobbies that aren't this work. And then you'll be able to do better work going forward.
Okay. Antonia, there's a question for you from Skylar. And she was interested in your experiences, which you've talked a little bit about in terms of growing up in Massachusetts. But her specific question is like, how did that shape you going into this story? The approach you took and, you know.
Yeah, I think it made me, I immediately had a resolve that kids' voices were going to be the center of this. And some of that was personal because of my own experience as a student, and feeling like I'd never had an outlet to talk about that and knowing what I knew about what actually happens in these hallways. And then some of it was also just looking at other coverage as other people were starting to talk about these issues or debate them on TV or, you know, write about them in newspapers. It just seemed like it was a lot of parents and politicians yelling back and forth, and kids were never given the opportunity to talk. So I think it was kind of like I was going back and like getting back in touch with a child version of me, which sounds like an exercise from therapy, honestly, where I was going back and like getting some guidance from that person. Like, what do you wish someone had asked you or checked in with you about when you were that age? When a kid made that comment to you, you know, what do you wish an administrator maybe had done in the moment? What are the things that I know typically happen? Like I think it really informed the questions that I remember to ask. And I think that's why we had these surprise moments, right? Where a student like Raven then opens up and mentions that she's had this experience and she has this audio and she trusts us and she's going to give it to us. Raven, we are not the first reporters Raven had spoken to. She had spoken at points to some other reporters. She had gone to meetings. She had shared some of her story. She had never told anyone about that incident that she had recorded. Me and Mike were the first people she told about that and who she shared that audio with. And I think that's because we spent hours in people's homes. We really dedicated time and resources to getting to know people, to just traveling around that town a lot to really understand the dynamics there. And I think that because of sort of that personal experience that I had growing up, it really helped me when I actually sat down on the couch with people to connect and ask the right questions that would lead us to the most revelatory reporting and information possible. And so I think it shaped everything I did. It's hard for me to even parse out what parts of the process it impacted or didn't impact. I'm grateful that my career is growing at this time where we as reporters are allowed to talk a bit more about our life experiences and who we are and how they shape us. And that's not seen as somehow, not by everyone anymore, as in being in tension with being a good reporter. And that's something I sit really comfortably in. I'm one of 7 Black kids that grew up in a community that was at times very hostile to all of us. I love kids and I love reporting on what's happened to them. And I think they have insights that are often a lot higher quality than sometimes adults do. And so that's just like a spirit I carry with me through a lot of my work. I was an immigration reporter for a long time. I often talked to kids when I did that work. And I think it's because, you know, they are often a lot more honest. They're not trying to put on filters, pretend to be people that they're not. And yeah, I think there's a little part of me that like wishes I could go back to different periods of my life and have had seen or been able to affect things in a way that they went differently. And I just didn't have that power or know better. And so I think it shaped everything. And I think, you know, it goes back to like the relationship between me and Mike, right? That like, I think when you tackle stories that have a lot of pain and hurt and trauma in them, it's important to remember, even if you maybe are the only reporter working on it, that you as a reporter aren't ever really alone. You should call friends. You should lean on reporting partners, managers, your editors. That's what they're there for. That's why, you know, newsrooms or even if you're a freelancer, you have networks of people that the whole point is that you reach out to them and you talk to them and they support you and they advise you through these things. And I was so lucky that Mike and I were having those conversations, because we would literally get in the car, talk about our lives, and then walk into a room and do an interview. So our lives absolutely shaped those conversations we had. Conversations were sometimes as little as 2 minutes apart. So yeah, I guess the short answer is it is, I carry it with me. I'm honest about it. I tell people about it so they can check me if they think I'm missing something or overemphasizing something. But it's a sort of inextricable part of me. And I think it's made me a stronger reporter, especially when the stories of kids are involved.
Thank you for that. We've got one from Edward. I'll give this to you, Mike. Do you think journalists should still report with objectivity, including all voices, even if some are proven wrong? And Russ is echoing in with that. Many readers are very concerned about rampant both sidesism in the media. Do you agree that that's a problem?
Those are great student questions. And I think a big conversation in our field
right now.
I do think it's a problem, and I think that but there's growing awareness, I think, among journalists, and an open debate that's really shaping kind of the future of this work for a lot of news organizations. Yeah, I won't speak for capital J journalism, mainstream media broadly, but I think the approach that I've taken is truth. We are objective in searching for truth and in elevating human experiences. And in the course of reporting, if we find, especially a statement by someone who's in a position of power, that their statement isn't accurate, not true, misleading, lacks historical context, if you're going to quote those things, you have to have the complete context, and that I think there's a lot of conversation now about this kind of idea of objectivity and neutral journalism is rooted in this idea that, or I guess the problem that poses is who's in the middle, whose objective truth is the middle, the perspective of upper class white man, or there have been a lot of examples, I think, of journalists working so hard to present both sides of a debate that they've lost that objective truth is what really we should be striving toward. And I'm kind of rambling here because it's a delicate question, and
yeah,
when I report a story, I can tell you that NBC has a rigorous standards vetting process, and we have standards that ethical reporting standards that every story is run through to make sure that everyone who's quoted or plays a major role in a story has an opportunity, multiple opportunities to weigh in, to give their perspective, to provide evidence that refutes claims made by others. That to me, that is where I think journalism, it's more important that we value that, which is doing everything we can to completely understand a subject from all sides, to turn over every rock, and to give people, every time we do a story like this, and we did this with the podcast and anyone who appears in an article, even if they've declined to talk to us, they're going to get an email from me days before the story comes out to give them time to respond, that lays out in bullet points everything the story is going to say. We call it a no surprises note. And that gives them an opportunity to jump in and to provide evidence that refutes any of the claims that others are making in the article. But that is not the same as saying, I'm going to give half of the time in this piece to one side and half of the time to the other side. There are times when that's warranted, and there are times actually when it's not.
All right. Cora has a question about American journalism today. And it's a good question. It's how do you think that we as journalists can gain trust in communities that might not normally trust journalists or the media? Do you think it's possible to gain that trust?
This is a tough one, but I would say I have found that really the only thing that makes a difference for me on these really complicated stories, in an age, as Mike spoke earlier, where people view mainstream media and news organizations like NBC, like the New York Times, Washington Post, CBS News as being, fake, as having an agenda, as being, in opposition to their political candidate of choice. It's hard. It's just harder. It is. But the only thing that's made a difference for me is in the amount of time and resources spent in those communities building relationships. So as I mentioned, the conservative voices that we were able to get, Mike and I spent hours pouring through records, school documents, and school board footage to get people's remarks and beliefs and concerns at length. We reached out to all those people multiple times, many times in some cases, and then went physically in person and made efforts, and also had many off the record conversations with people, that never, of course, made it into the podcast, but in which we answered their questions. We spoke and educated them about the reporting process at times. And we were really honest. And while it didn't lead to us being able to have this like perfectly equal, process where we go into Raven, the Black student who confronted the principal and student who said the N-words home, and we sat on her couch, and then we sat on the couch of the student who said the N-word, it wasn't like going to be that perfectly balanced, but we were able to talk to people. We were able to get people to tell us why they felt this way. And so it's time and investment. It's building up a culture in your newsroom where you're going to be given that time to build relationships and do real, like kind of old school, like I'm boots on the ground reporting. It's hard to build relationships, honest relationships. It's hard to get people to trust you. It's hard to dispel myths over the phone, I find. And so finding ways in which you can get out in your local community and actually meet people, be at events where they do talk, but meet them where they are. Those are the things that make a difference right now. As to the question of like, can we heal this whole thing? One of the frustrating things as a reporter, right, is like Mike and I and people like me and Mike, like we're not in charge of the bigger system. And so some of these levers are out of our control. And a bigger system, I mean, literally the business behind all of this. But we can, in all the editorial and individual decisions and the stories that we pitch, we can make an impact. And so I think when you step into this work, you just have to kind of come in with that commitment. But yeah, it's a huge, I mean, Mike, I don't know what you would maybe add to this, but I think this is the big sort of question and crisis facing our industry. And you have to keep it at the forefront of your mind in all of your interactions and the way in which you spend your time and reporting resources so that you can do the best possible job you can in those circumstances.
And actually, we're going to have to wrap up. So I want to ask one last question, which is the one I foreshadowed earlier, what advice would you give students who are really interested, but perhaps feel a bit intimidated about venturing into this space, which, as you guys have described, is really fraught and challenging, and where there's a whole lot of disagreement and pain?
I think I would give the recommendation that I think Antonia started with at the top of this conversation, which is to think about historical context and to spend some time reading some of the history of battles over education in this country. You know, from the fights over how we talk about teach evolution, to the fights over who was even allowed to attend public schools, to, you know, sex ed, to, you know, and to think about what's happening now in that broader historical context. Because I think, you know, as we look around and the story is continuing forward and it's evolving, you know, there's now this kind of growing, I shouldn't even say growing, you know, there's a long simmering movement in this country to privatize education, to create state funding for private Christian education, to insert Christian values in public schools. And that movement has kind of hitched its wagon to this fight over critical race theory or LGBTQ inclusion, and all of the political energy that's going into that. And so I think, you know, you have to kind of understand that history and then look at what's happening, because one of the challenges we faced in reporting on this was the story was happening so fast and changing under our feet. And so if you're going to work on a long-term project, you know, you need to be able to see where the story is going a little bit. And the history books, I think, help you identify that, so that you can tell a story that's relevant when it comes out in 6 months or a year.
Antonia, last word.
I think my last word would be, you know, if you're a journalism student, you know, hoping to do this kind of work, I think, one, finding your real friends and support systems in this industry is what's going to carry you through all those things. You know, I talked a lot about my relationship with Mike, and I'm not just saying that to be nice to him because we have more work to get done together. You know, it really, I don't think I could have pulled all this off alone. I don't know, maybe Mike thinks he could have done it all without me, but it was a lot of work and a lot of hard nights and weekends working on this, and the emotional impact of some of the stuff we've talked about. I processed a lot of that with him. So finding your people, your friends, your mentors who are going to have your back and you can bounce questions off of is huge. I think also just really like growing comfortable in who you are, your own history, your family, your life, the good and the bad things that have happened to you. Those are all things that you bring to the table that make you really smart, really special, that are going to make you ask questions no one else thought to ask. So, you know, I often talk to other Black, you know, young journalists who are worried that people are going to look at them and not want them to cover race, or not want them to cover, you know, public schools with a lot of kids who look like them. They're worried that people are going to look down on them in newsrooms. And you do still encounter some of that. But I really do believe that your life experiences, your cultural, your racial identity, those things, as long as you acknowledge and you talk about them and you check with friends and you make sure you don't have blind spots to the best of your ability, that they actually make you a much stronger reporter. They make newsrooms so much better. They make stories so much more interesting and better told. And so kind of figuring out who you are, your voice, and starting to use it early in newsrooms, pitching stories, even if you're in your low entry level first gig. I remember mine, I didn't have health insurance and it was tough to live in New York, but I was still raising my hand and pitching stories and getting out in the field when I could with correspondents that I used to work for. And like learning who you are, how to defend a story, how to really execute, just really like actually like starting to use your voice and figure out like what your, and I don't mean perspective as an opinion, but sort of your perspective, your story, your niche, your area of expertise, that's going to make you a really strong reporter. Really like actually celebrating who you are and owning who you are. It's going to make you really good at helping other people tell their stories, at going really deep on tough issues. And some of that actually even connects to what Mike said, you know, reading, knowing history, knowing a lot about the world that has come even way before you helps you actually understand a lot about yourself, your parents, who you come from. So spending time enjoying and celebrating and being proud of those things is going to make you good at this job. And so invest in that and just be really proud of who and honest about who you are, and don't shy away from that. I think people who shy away from it find it hard to get that voice back. So go into this industry owning who you are, and you'll be able to do really, really great work.
Well, I love ending anything with a discussion just like the one that we had. History is near and dear to my heart. I write about slavery and its contemporary legacies, and telling our students to kind of lean into who they are and is a really important thing and an important message. And I want to thank you both for coming and for joining us tonight. If you haven't listened to Southlake, you have some time now to do it, and some inclination, I think. And I want to thank all of the folks who came out to listen and shared their questions with us tonight. Thank you both, and please stay tuned for more excellent programming from NYU Journalism and our Diversity Committee. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.